Good day, and welcome back to the Ottawa History Hub podcast. With the building of the canal and the expansion of the agricultural economy, of lumber, and the continuing fur trade, Bytown was putting down roots as a more stable community on the Ottawa River. While Wrightstown was an orderly production, benefiting from the vision and planning of Philman Wright, Bytown's development was much more of a catch-as-catch-can operation. The colonial government built an orderly canal and garrison, then a handful of roads to other nearby destinations, like Richmond Road to the west, leading to Richmond, Montreal Road to the east, leading to Montreal, and Prescott Road to the south, going to, well, you guessed it, Prescott. Colonel By tried to build some infrastructure in our current downtown, but much of that was cast away when John By was so publicly dishonored in the newspapers of London. Between 1832, when the canal was completed, and 1850, when Bytown was officially incorporated as a town, Bytown existed as a lawless pandemonium deep in the forested interior of the Canadas. I like the word pandemonium. It comes from the Greek, meaning a place of all the demons. In 1667's Paradise Lost, John Milton named Satan's palace in the middle of hell to be Pandemonium. We're not going to be looking at all the demons today, but we will be looking at some organized purveyors of villainy across the Ottawa Valley, who called themselves the Shiners, and their leader, the notorious Peter Aylin. When I was a lowly undergrad at Carleton University, I lived in Westboro with some really wonderful flatmates, and I would walk past this old building near the corner of Kirkwood and Richmond on my way to catch one of those elusive buses that on rare occasions grace the distance between my home and the university. OC Transpo and the Delusions of Adequacy will be a future episode, no doubt. I didn't know what the building was, just that it had a heritage plaque which read, Aylin Henny House, 150 Richmond Road, as built in the 1830s. This building housed laborers who worked on the farm of Peter Aylin. Aylin was notorious as the leader of the Shiners, Irish laborers whose riotous habits enlivened early Bytown. Enliven sounds like they were rascally scamps and rogues up to some mischief or another. I'm going to take this opportunity to issue my first content warning. These people were not friendly rapscallions adding color or livelihood to a quiet settlement. They were demons made flesh in this place. Peter Aylin was born Peter Vallely in Armagh, Ireland in 1799 to a mixed Catholic-Protestant family. At age 14, he was a cabin boy on a British trader and jumped ship in Quebec City in 1815, never to return. The now 15-year-old changed his name from Vallely to Aylin, taking his mother's maiden name to avoid reimpressment, and went upriver in the direction of Columbia Falls, or Wrightstown as the locals called it. He might not have had much in terms of money or connections, but he had a head for numbers and basic education, which, when combined with a rough-and-tumble disposition and a brutal aggression that had been nurtured by formative years at sea, this fueled his respectability in the Ottawa Valley lumber trade. He went from a lumberman to a foreman to holding lumber rights in the Gatineau and the upper Madawaska rivers. It would seem that he was on his way to becoming a respectable lumber baron, like Egan, Bronson, Bell, and many others. He even partnered with some of the progenies of Philman Wright in the form of Ruggles, Tiberius, and Christopher Wright. He married Eleanor Thompson, a devotee of Nepean lumbermen, and, to evoke Mr. Tom Petty, the future was wide open. During the construction of the Rideau Canal, there were roughly 7,000 workers, 60% of which were Irish, and 15% of those 7,000 workers died during the 6 years of construction. Much like the lumber trade, the construction business was also dangerous and brutal, and the likelihood of a quiet retirement at the end of a comfortable career was negligible. In 32, the canal was complete, and thousands of workers needed a new job. Many of the lumber companies preferred to hire the French because of existing contract relations and a general distrust of the Irish. The desperation of the Irish was where Aylin focused his business strategy. He hired Irish to act as lumberjacks in his camps and took advantage of the sense of community in the face of English laws or French establishment workers. The core of the Irish lumbermen in Aylin's employ were to be called shiners, a corruption of the French chênier, or ochre, oak being the most expensive of the woods that lumberjacks would harvest. The population was almost exclusively male, with few women back in Bytown for the lumbermen to call family. Jane McGaughey at Concordia University in Montreal has written a great deal about how this affected the subculture of the Irish. In particular, their sense of self, coming not from family or religion, as it traditionally would have, but from a sense of performative masculinity. That being strong, tough, and generically masculine was the center of much of the social standing within this population. Aylin and the shiners could have continued to enrich themselves from the lumber trade, which ran during the winter months, and in springtime the lumber would be sent downriver to Montreal and Quebec City for export. Starting in the summer of 32, however, the shiners would become seasonal overlords of Bytown. When the military partially withdrew, along with the canal construction, the shiners would become the parallel structure of force in the community. As that pillar of strength within the population of Bytown, the shiners were a secretive lot. They were known publicly by all, but made an effort to keep no records, nor raise any monuments. This is a habitual problem when researching organized crime. The subject of the studies has gone out of their way not to have a record. Whether it be the invisible army of the Ku Klux Klan, the Mafia, the Yakuza, or the Bratva, one-percenter MCs, the records are often from police and law enforcement, which didn't really exist in Bytown at the time, so as a researcher, I have to make do with what I've got. You may recall from episode 17, The Timber Town, lumber was brought downriver in giant floats of wood, bound together with rope and sinew, so as not to damage the material that was to be sold at market. Accompanying rafts were a handful of rivermen who could safely pilot the ebbs and flows of the Ottawa on their way to Montreal and through the Rideau Canal onward to Quebec City. Wading downriver, out of sight of any local authorities, were small crews of shiners, ready to row out to the undefendable rafts and simply take the winter's harvest by force. The rivermen could swim to shore or drown, or be battered by the pirates, who would then take the cargo for their own resale. In Lower Town, businesses would pay protection money to the shiners, or stand back while their establishment was burned to the ground, or their staff and patrons were assaulted. While many Irish-owned businesses accepted to pay the tax to the shiners, many French-owned did not, and they were in turn subjected to much of the indignant rage of the Irish gang. The shiners particularly targeted French businessmen in Bytown, as well as French-staffed rafts on the river. It's hard to tell how much of this was rivalry, how much of it was racial animus, and how much of it was public diplomacy, of positioning themselves as the champions of the Irish in the Ottawa Valley against the French who took their jobs and opportunity. In 34, one farmer who didn't pay the tax was returning home from market in a sleigh when he was attacked by shiners. His pregnant wife was then dragged behind the sleigh on the frozen ground until she cut herself free. The horses were returned to the farmer with their ears and tails cut off, a characteristic message being sent by the shiners. On another occasion, the funeral of a non-payer was disrupted, his cortege intercepted, and coffin emptied onto the muddy road. In addition to the piracy and extortion, the shiners took control of the south end of the Union Bridge, charging tolls to anyone crossing into Upper Canada. I've been using terms like paying a tax or charging a toll, and I've not been doing so euphemistically. Same with calling Peter Aylin the king of the shiners. In a time without a strong state or police or fire department, the vacuum of power was occupied by the shiners. They were very much the parallel authority that would have been occupied by a government that was simply not there. The police force in the mid-30s was 9 people for a town of 1,500. There were 200 members of the shiners. What were the police going to do to stop them? The nearest courthouse and jail were in Perth, 50 miles away. If the local constables tried to escort prisoners down the Rideau River for a trial and imprisonment, they were likely to be ambushed along the way, their prisoners freed, and their own safety very much compromised. In 1935, Peter Aylin and the shiners stepped out of the shadows of the back alleys and riverside forests where they had been hiding, and stepped into public life. While Bytown would have another 15 years to go before becoming a proper town, with proper elections, mayors, and a town council, one of the most important civil organizations was the Bathurst District Agricultural Society. This was an organization that could lobby governments, support policies, and have a voice in York and Montreal. Membership was $1, and on their executive election day in August, Aylin arrived with a company of shiners and enough money to buy everyone a membership. Aylin and 2 of his lieutenants were elected as the society's directors, much to the dismay of the regular members. The stratagem worked so nice that they tried it twice, and a year and a half later, in January of 1937, the Nepean Township Council met in Stanley's Tavern to quietly elect 3 councillors. Aylin arrived with about 50 of his soldiers in tow to force himself onto the ballot, and those who would stand against him were forced off. One of his opponents, James Johnson, was the editor of the Bytown Independent and Farmers Advocate, the largest newspaper in town, and he and his faction were beaten with fists, with feet, with sticks and horsewhips, in the tavern, outside of the tavern, and on the streets. It was not just Johnson and his faction that were dispersed, but the entire township association, leaving only Aylin and his lieutenants as the legitimate, elected voices of the people. Soldiers from the barracks had to restore order. Johnson wrote about the incident in the newspaper and even wrote to the Lieutenant Governor, Francis Bondhead, asking for a permanent military presence to bring order to Bytown. In his letter, he told the governor that Mr. Peter Aylin has already proved to all Bytown that he neither respects himself, nor fears God, nor man. The laws are like cobwebs to him. There are now several warrants out for his apprehension, but there is not a constable in Bytown who will undertake to arrest him. This open, published letter was too much for Aylin, who sent a crew to Johnson's home. They fired into his bedroom, only to find that he was not at home. The shiners fanned out over Lower Town to find the editor, eventually catching him crossing Sapper's Bridge. Johnson jumped off the bridge into a snowbank to escape, where his skull was broken in several places, though he implausibly managed to survive. This attempted murder was a bridge too far for the people of Bytown, who called out for justice. 3 shiners were arrested for the near homicide and brought to Perth to stand trial with a large escort. That was not the end of that, as it would turn out. A company of shiners mustered in Perth and freed their captured comrades from the jail, using the threat of numbers and violence against the constables and jailers, and then brought their newly liberated captives into hiding. They were later recaptured and sentenced to 3 years of hard labor. That would mark the end of the shiners as a parallel authority in Bytown. After the winter lumber season, shiners returned to Bytown to discover that the Association for the Preservation of the Peace and the Bytown Rifles had mustered enough strength to prevent the shiners from retaking their position of prominence. While Peter Aylin was known to be a wealthy landlord and brutal strongman on the south shore of the Ottawa, he was relatively unknown in Lower Canada, where he decided to move in 1937, ahead of any legal entanglements that might happen in Upper Canada. He moved from his farmstead on Richmond Road to Sims Landing, the future Aylmer, where he would be a respectable member of the local gentry. He would serve as a city councillor for Hull Township in 1946, as well as the superintendent of roads for Ottawa County, and, if you can believe it, a justice of the peace. One of his sons would become a lawyer, one a doctor, and one both a lawyer and a doctor. Just a quick reminder to everyone that in the mid-19th century, public respectability came not from the character of the individual, but from their wallet. As to how true that remains to this day, well, that would be a little outside the limits of my own wisdom. For those of you who like historical fiction, I'm going to take a minute to talk about two books that I like, and are both reviewed on my website at ottawahistoryhub.com. The first is Unrest by Gwen Twinman, and the second is Shiner's War by Connor Ryan. Both take place with the Shiner's War as a backdrop. Unrest is a narrative fiction story where there are 4 POV characters, all members of a family that are involved in the lumber trade, the Shiners, and the Bytown of the day. It takes place in 3738, so at the high point and end of the Shiners' power in the valley. A lot of the story is from the perspective of women, and it has some strong insight into the home life of regular people during the period, as well as the Catholic-Protestant divide. It's 440 pages, so not exactly a light read, but I enjoyed it. The second book, Shiner's War, is a graphic novel which is regrettably out of print now. I got a copy from the Metcalfe branch of the Ottawa Public Library. It's only 60 pages, and not as narrative-driven as Unrest, with simpler characters, but the art is quite good, and you can read it in an hour or two. I really enjoyed both these books. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Ottawa History Hub podcast. If you'd like to reach me, you can do so through the contact page on the website at ottawahistoryhub.com or directly at ottawahistoryhub@gmail.com. You can follow me on Facebook and Blue Sky as Ottawa History Hub, or on Twitter X as @OttHistoryHub. Next week, we're going to be looking at one of the champions of the French population in Bytown at the time, who famously stood up to the Shiners in the bars, on the streets, and the forests. His name was Joseph Montferrand, better known in English circles as Big Joe Mufferall. Until then, take care everyone, and advance Ottawa, en avant!